There is no ideal instrument, and we may demonstrate it on the example of these two indices. So Timbro is a bit over-inclusive because even social democratic parties, Christian democratic parties, and all other parties that we usually call cartel parties or catch-all parties, following the tradition of Otto Kirchheimer, are included in this index in the category of populist parties, just because of their catch-all strategy or cartel strategy. It is a question whether it is so necessary to include them. And populist, yes, actually, it is a very good index for sure, but it is slightly outdated, even in the most recent version that was published, I guess, this year. The information about the mergers between parties, about the coalitions, about the emergence of some new parties on the basis of 2 or 3 previously existing ones, it was not counted in this index. And even if a party has changed its name, it appeared in the populist index 2020 under its old name. So sometimes it is a bit inconvenient, but for sure the small inconvenience cannot reduce the actuality and usefulness of the entire index. And yes, all tools, all software, all indices have their own advantages and disadvantages, and we should choose several at least to combine and to compare actually the results of comparison, if you may say so, to find out whether they are relevant enough or not so relevant. Political culture and nationalism as variables. Just a moment. Yes. Political culture typology. There are several typologies again, but the most widespread, the most widely used is the typology of Gabriel Allmont and Sidney Verba. 3 types of de facto, let's say, political cultures: parochial, subject, and participatory, and some ideal combination of these 3. Civic culture. Is it still a useful concept? Because a lot of my colleagues from Russia and from abroad say that this typology is outdated. It is no more relevant. It is not fashionable to use the very notion of political culture in a political analysis. However, if we combine it with regional classifications, if we somehow put it on the map and provide historical explanations to why this certain type of political culture emerged and why it has transformed this way or not the other, then I suppose, it's my opinion, it is my point of view, this political culture triad, this political culture notion is still very useful. Different Eastern European scholars, I may name just 2 of them, Evan Levaiko and Vladimir Tismeniano, wrote about the special culture of resentment or culture of fear that emerged in the region of Central and Eastern Europe. This is to be combined with the notion of post-assessment crisis, coined by Attila Ag, a Hungarian scholar. And post-assessment crisis is the crisis that emerged again in Central and Eastern Europe after the assessment to the European Union. The crisis of high expectations, it may be called also. All these theories, all these notions are also to be included, in fact, in the political cultural approach and the political cultural explanation. And I hope I'll a bit later show you this on the examples of the particular countries, of the particular clusters of the countries. And nationalism, as we have also briefly discussed yesterday, just a quick reminder, it also is a multi-faced phenomenon. It may be ethnic, it may be civic, civilizational, nativist, racist, and so on and so forth. And it differs, the types of nationalism differ in the regions, in the sub-regions of the European Union. Euroscepticism is a variable. For sure, we may use the degree of Euroscepticism as a variable. Again, there are nice and great classifications of Euroscepticism. One of the most popular is the classification of Paul Taggart, and I have also mentioned it yesterday. Classification into soft and hard Euroscepticism. Another classification, a bit more sophisticated, was coined by Sofia Vassilopoulou, a Greek scholar, Greek American, okay. But again, whether we speak about Euroscepticism or EU skepticism, a strange question maybe, because we usually speak of Euroscepticism, but let's think a bit more about it. Usually, Eurosceptics within the European Union or outside European Union do not criticize Europe as a concept, Europe as an image. They criticize the European Union, the European integration project we have now. Because for many Eurosceptics, European integration is also okay, but not an integration in the form of the European Union. It may be an integration in the form of a coalition of national states, but not the so-called United States of Europe, a trope commonly used by many Eurosceptic parties. But still, the discursive use of the term Euroscepticism dominates and prevails, so I think we should stick to this term, but bearing in mind that in fact Euroscepticism is not so much about Europe as a civilizational continuum, but about the European Union. If we speak about the parties present in the European Parliament, Eurosceptics operating inside European institutions. To some extent, it is a paradox, because by operating inside European institutions, EU institutions, in fact, the Eurosceptic parties give some legitimization to what they actually oppose in their own rhetoric. But the benefits from participating in European institutions such as European Parliament are higher than the possible drawbacks. The benefits are, for instance, the European Parliament may be used as a free microphone, more or less free, as a tool to enhance the influence of the party domestically and not also domestically. and finally as a tool to get finances, to get money. It is also an important aspect that we should not forget about. As I've again already said yesterday, Euroscepticism is typical of all the European right-wing populist parties. I'll use this abbreviation quite commonly. So right-wing populist parties, and not also right-wing populist parties, also left-wing populist parties as well. One has to speak about the EU because the European integration is salient. It is a salient issue, and if we mute about this, if the populist parties do not say a word about this, they will be asked, and what do you actually think about the EU? And it is quite logical. Simultaneously, the Eurosceptic parties are subject and an object of European integration. How is it possible? As a subject, they take part in decisions, in coining and forming decisions and elaborating decisions within the structures of the European Union, within the European Parliament, European Commission, and so on. And they are also an object of European integration because European integration influence them, influence the member states they to some extent represent, and so on. Both soft and hard Euroscepticism, if we stick to the dichotomy of Paul Taggart, have we may find at least 3 dimensions of critique. The Eurosceptics use to criticize the European Union: economic, institutional, and so-called cultural critique. So if we take the economic critique, it is first of all critique of Eurozone. Critique of euro as unflexible currency that has replaced flexible and convenient national money, and also here count all possible economic programs not so effective according to the Eurosceptic parties. Institutional critique. It is first of all about the so-called lack of transparency, lack of democracy inside the European institutions, and the need to transform the European institutions and maybe to reduce the European machinery that is sometimes labeled as too big and not reflecting the actual necessities of the EU member states. And cultural, in parentheses, critique, it is more about multiculturalism and migration, because multiculturalism as a strategy of accommodating cultural and ethnic cleavages, it is usually associated with the European Union. It is a question whether it is rightly associated with it or not entirely. In fact, not entirely, because multiculturalism is still a choice of the respective member states and not of the EU. But discursively, at least in the discourse of Eurosceptics, of populists, and here, first of all, right-wing populists, multiculturalism and European integration go hand in hand. So cultural critique is directed towards these aspects of European integration, if we may call it an aspect of European integration. And the recent elections to the European Parliament took place in May 2019, and what we actually saw, the decline of traditional groups accommodating populist deputies of European Free Alliance, and sorry, not European Free Alliance, but Europe of Nations Freedom and some others. The decline was caused partly by Brexit, because the British deputies left the groups and the European Parliament, partly by some regrouping of national parliaments and of national of the positions of the party at the national level. For instance, the Dutch Party for Freedom was not elected to the European Parliament at all, not a single member. And we saw the birth of one single but very mighty right-wing, first of all, right-wing populism actor in the European Union. It is the political group entitled Identity and Democracy, or ID. First, it was led by Matteo Salvini. Now, because of certain crisis, Matteo Salvini is not so influential already in this group, but still it combines it combines, it includes the deputies representing most right-wing and Eurosceptic parties present in the European Parliament. Let us have a closer look at the exact cases that we want to compare. The first is Benelux. Why we compare clusters? So why we compare cases inside regional clusters? Why we put the cases into some bigger structure, but not that big as the European Union? Country cases for sure are very interesting and important, as well as the European Union as a supranational system. But regional cluster comparison gives us the opportunity to generalize a bit more without losing from the sight national specific. We do not integrate the parties supranationally. We do not look at them now, at least, in the context, or in the global context, or in the context of the European Union, but we still make a level up in abstract thinking, and we integrate national cases into something bigger. For sure, it is a controversial point of view, but that's just my opinion and my proposal to do this way. So if we compare cases inside the cluster of Benelux, why we can actually look at Benelux as a cluster? Because of different factors. First of all, because of the history of this region. Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg were tied very closely during the recent centuries, and for a short period from 1815 to 1830, they were situated in one kingdom, the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. And since 1921, Benelux cooperation organization exists, and the three countries together were founding members of the European Union, together with France, Italy, and Western Germany. So I think we may exploit these historical circumstances to substantiate our comparison of the countries within Benelux. What is typical of all of these three countries? It is participatory political culture, dominating participatory political culture. For sure, it does not mean that only participatory political culture exists in these countries, but it dominates. And from here, we see high degree of right-wing institutionalization and the embeddedness, sorry, of these parties in the political system. For sure, there are marginal actors, but usually if we have some political group, some political movement, at a particular moment, it transforms into a party and begins to operate officially in the parliament and maybe later even in the government. This was the case of Forum for Democracy, one of the major right-wing populist parties in the Netherlands. It formed, first of all, as a think tank, supporting the campaign Geen Pijl against the association agreement with the Ukraine. But later on, it transformed into a political party, and quite a successful political party. What is also typical of at least two of the cases here for Belgium and the Netherlands, it is the legacy of pillarization en français, verzuiling, it is called in Dutch language. It is the vertical division of the entire society into pillars that existed. I guess this system started to form in the late 19th century, but it took the form, its final form after the First World War. And it disappeared, I guess, in 1980s, in 1970s and 1980s, but still we have to deal with the legacy of this system. So the entire society was divided into pillars. In the case of the Netherlands, these were socialist, liberal, Catholic, and Protestant. In the case of Belgium, these were just socialist, liberal, and Catholic or clerical. And so we may say that now right-wing populist parties become one of the, now not officially existing for sure, but still existing in the minds of the Dutch voters, of the pillars of the political system. So we deal with the fourth in the case of the Netherlands, and in the case of Belgium, and fifth in the case of the Netherlands, pillar, right-wing people. Right-wing populist pillar. And liberal democratic paradigm that was formed here historically led to low salience of biopolitical, geopolitical, and religious issues. There are religious parties in the Netherlands, for sure, Protestant parties first of all, but they're not populist. At least they are not right-wing, and they are quite moderate. In right or left-wing populist rhetoric, religion plays no role at all. And biopolitics is quite libertarian. And we'll see this especially on the example of the Netherlands. Geopolitics is actually quite maybe interesting here, because I found maybe one manifestation of geopolitical ambitions of the Dutch parties, of the Dutch Party for Freedom, when the possible split of Belgium was discussed into the Flemish and the Walloon regions. Then Geert Wilders, the leader of the Party for Freedom, told that we will be very glad to accept our Flemish brethren into the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And for Belgium, yes, geopolitics is more important, but still it is not so about geography, but more about politics. So again, geopolitical issue as it is has lost its salience. And the dominant form of nationalism is either civilizational or nativist. We cannot say about the presence of strong ethnic nationalism here in this region, because again, as I've said yesterday, more frequently we hear about the European values, about the European civilization, than about the Dutch or the Belgium or the Walloon or the Flemish or the Luxembourgish. This was exemplified, for instance, by a speech made by Geert Wilders in Tel Aviv, where he praised Israel for being the last border of the European civilization in the Middle East. And Thierry Baudet, the leader of Forum for Democracy, another right-wing populist party in the Netherlands, in the speech right after the elections, he underlined that the Netherlands is a part of the Boreal civilization. Boreal meaning in his discourse Nordic. Okay, quite interesting, but the fact, the quote. So the specifics of the countries. In the Netherlands, two major actors: Partij voor Vrijheid, it is the Party for Freedom, and Forum for Democracy. But Party for Freedom, it emerged in 2006. Now it lost its influence. As I have already said, no single deputy from this party was elected to the European Parliament in May. And it lost a lot of its voters to the new actor, brand new actor, Forum for Democracy, that emerged in 2017, I guess. Forum for Democracy presents itself, at least in its rhetoric, as a more moderate actor and a more reliable actor, and quite possibly a future partner for a coalition. Here on the slide, I have mentioned the legacy of Pim Fortuyn. Who was Pim Fortuyn? He was one of the founders of the current right-wing populist scene in the Netherlands with his party, Lijst Pim Fortuyn. And he developed a libertarian approach to moral and biopolitical values that is perceived by now by Geert Wilders and Thierry Baudet. In Belgium, there is also a specific. There is a clear domination of Flemish parties in the right-wing populist camp. In Wallonia, in the Walloon region, Socialist Party dominates, and there is not a single successful right-wing populist party. There is, in fact, a party called Démocratie Nationale, but it has no representation at all. And New Flemish Alliance and Flemish Interest, Nieuwe Vlaamse Alliantie and Vlaams Belang, they are quite popular in Belgium. New Flemish Alliance is I guess since the elections of 2011, it is the biggest party in the Flemish region and the biggest party in the federal parliament. Flemish Interest, that is more radical and more nationalist, lost its influence on the in the elections of 2015, but in 2019 it regained its popularity. So its presentation rose 3 times. What was the reason for this? One of the reasons was that New Flemish Alliance was present in the governing coalition. They left the governing coalition in 2018, but still they were regarded as responsible for not very popular measures of the government. That's why the regionalist and nationalist voters preferred to give a second chance to a more radical counterpart of the New Flemish Alliance. And what is also very specific of Belgium, of the Belgian case, the salience of regionalist or sometimes even separatist agenda. The Flemish interests, the Flemish interest says quite overtly about the necessity to establish an independent Flemish Republic. The New Flemish Alliance speaks more about the further federalization and confederalization of the country, but nevertheless it is an autonomous rhetoric. As to Luxembourg, here also there is some right-wing populist party present. It is Alternative Democratic Reform Party, Alternative Demokratische Reformpartei. It is well, it is not stigmatized. It may be a partner in a coalition, in fact. It grew out of the ecologist movement, but now for sure it is an all-encompassing political party. And the special salience of language issues was typical for Luxembourg, for Luxembourg right-wing populist actors, because until 1984, Luxembourgish was not an official language, a state language in Luxembourg itself, and by now it is not an official language in the European Union. So there is much terrain for actions. Let's take the next cluster, the Baltics. Oh, sorry. Again, what is typical for all of the Baltic cases is historically formed subject political culture. Again, not a single, but dominating, and re-sovereignizzational agenda. Both are the legacy of the Soviet times, of the Soviet years. Subject political culture was formed under the pressure of the Soviets, and the re-sovereignizational agenda, re-sovereignizational discourse, again, was a part of party politics after 1990. Because of the circumstances, the realization of nation-state project, of nation-state building project, was a bit delayed. So nation-state began to reform maybe again after the short period of prosperity between 1918 and 1940. In 1990s, when in the rest of Europe, I mean, first of all, in the Western Europe, nation states as a phenomenon were not already quite popular, were not that fashionable anymore, if we may say so. From this discordance, maybe of or time lapse, high salience of geopolitical and ethnic aspects. that is typical of the Baltic populist parties. Geopolitical because the discourse of internal and external other is very relevant for any party, not even only populist party. External other in most cases is actually Russia, the neighbor in Russia, but in some cases, as for some left or right-wing populist parties, it is the United States or Brussels. Brussels as a new Moscow, as it's sometimes labeled. The salience of an ethnic aspect is intensified in Estonia and Latvia, especially by the presence of a visible Russian minority. It is not even visible, it is 25% of the population. In Lithuania, there is another ethnic issue quite salient, the Polish minority. That is constantly a source of problems in bilateral Lithuanian-Polish relations. And that is always a target of nationalist groupings. So because of this salience, ethnic form of nationalism dominates in the Baltic right-wing populism discourse. Country specifics. In Estonia and in Latvia, there are respectively, two major right-wing populist actors. In Estonia, it is Estonian Conservative People's Party, EKRE. Yeah, Eesti Konservatiivne Rahvaerakond. In Latvia, it is National Alliance, Nacionāla apvienība. They both are quite young. Yes, EKRE emerged in 2015, and National Alliance, it emerged in 2012. But their predecessors have existed for quite a long period of time. The formation of these successful parties was in both cases, the result of a merger of established conservatives. In both Estonia and Latvia, these conservative parties, right-wing conservative parties, existed even since 1990 something. In Latvia, it was 1994, I guess. In Estonia, it was 1991. And they merged at a certain stage of their development with radical movements, marginalized radical movements. What was the sense of it? The voters were a bit tired of classical established conservative parties. And they were in constant search for something new. But still a bit scared to vote for marginals, to vote for radicals, young radicals that were organizing torch manifestations in the capitals and so on. So the established parties brought their influence and respectfulness, if I may say so, and their money. That is also important. Radical movements brought new young blood and new young ideas, and to some extent some new drive, if I may say so. In Lithuania, the situation is a bit more complicated. I briefly mentioned it yesterday. At least I personally cannot identify a visible, successful right-wing populist parties. For sure, populism is present. Darbo Partija, the Labour Party, or Tvarka ir Teisingumas, but this populism is predominantly centrist or maybe even to some extent left wing. There are nationalist movements, for instance, Tautininku Sąjunga, the Union of Nationalists, but it is marginalized. It does not have any presentation at all in the parliament, I mean, and it cannot be labeled as populist because quite often it even employs extremist tactics. For instance, if we open the website of Tautininku Sąjunga, the Nationalist Union, we see on the front page of its website the words Lietuva Lietuviams, Lithuania for the Lithuanians. Quite interesting motto, I would say. And the reasons for such a clear absence of visible successful right-wing populist parties are yet to be discovered. It may be a subject of yes, of a separate research, of a particular research. And the third cluster I wanted to cover in this maybe a bit short presentation is populism in power in CEE, in Central and Eastern Europe. So here I combine Poland and Hungary because they are more comparable between each other than, for instance, Czechia, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia. When we speak about Poland and Hungary, what is common to their right-wing populism, present in Poland and Hungary? Again, subject political culture dominating before the 1980s. It is not just my opinion, just my thoughts. It is supported by data presented by numerous Polish and American scientists under the communist rule and also under the regime of Jaruzelski in Poland. Subject political culture was doomed to be formed. High salience of religious and biopolitical issues. Again, I've mentioned it yesterday. For both Poland and Hungary, religion and biopolitics are very important. For Poland, it is definitely the Catholic Church, because the very Polishness is defined by one of the founding fathers of the modern Polish nationalism, Roman Dmowski. The Polishness is a combination of the Polish soil and the Catholic faith. And in Hungary, it is not only Catholicism, because in Hungary, a Calvinist minority is also present, in Debrecen especially, and an interesting fact, Viktor Orban, he is not a Catholic, he is a Calvinist, he is a Protestant. That's why in the brand new constitution of Hungary, notorious for its mention in the ethnic Hungarians, the necessity to protect ethnic Hungarians with, regardless of their citizenship. Religion is also mentioned, but Christianity is mentioned. Christian civilization, Christian legacy, and not specifically Catholic or Protestant or Orthodox. Geopolitics, yes, I've already mentioned minority issues in Hungary, and first of all, this is the issue of Jewish diaspora and Roma diaspora and Roma minority in Hungary, because a lot of politicians, especially representing Jobbik party, the Party for a Better Hungary, made attempts to yes, to defamate the Jewish people and the Roma people, and even in the framework of the European Parliament, where they were elected. Plus the issue of diaspora, especially in Hungary. The huge Hungarian diaspora is present in Romania, in Transylvania, in Ukraine, in the Carpathia, in Slovakia. And the practice used widely by the Hungarian government is to issue the so-called legitimation of a Hungarian, such a greenish book, greenish brochure that verifies your membership in the Hungarian nation, in the ethnic Hungarian nation. The same is actually true for Poland. I mean, the so-called card of a Pole. It is issued for Poles living in Belarus, in Russia, in Ukraine, I guess also in Slovakia and so on. I am not sure. I cannot say for 100%. So ethnic form of nationalism is dominating the discourse. Resovereignizational rhetoric causes ambivalent attitude toward the European Union. The above-mentioned post-assessment crisis intensified by the sanctions and the discussions condemning the authoritarian regimes formed in Poland and Hungary in the recent years. The EU is seen and is presented by Orban and Kaczynski as an enemy, in fact, as some external power that tries to impose its rules, its worldview on the free and independent Polish and Hungarian peoples. It is their rhetoric, not mine. Yes, so Brussels is interpreted as I've already said, a new Moscow, and the image in Hungary, for instance, of 1956 is invoked again, but this time not from the Soviet Russia, but from the Soviet Europe, if I may say so, from the European Union. In both countries, successful right-wing populist parties formed the governments, respectively Prawo I Sprawiedliwość in Poland and Fidesz in Hungary, and now influence the entire political systems. Often they are seen and, well, it may be justified as dictatorships within the European Union. In the recent years, sufficient attempts to curtail the freedom of press, the freedom of education, the freedom of courts, the freedom of justice, judiciary were made. Even the Central European University had to move its headquarters from Budapest to Vienna. And how these parties came to power, there is also some common traits, some common features. I'm sorry, it is my neighbors attempting to reparate their wall. Yes, sorry for this strange sound. Hopefully, it wouldn't last for very long. So both these parties won the battle. Again, more radical right-wing actors. So again, moderateness and less radical discourse wins, in fact. It attracts more voters, more people to the party than radical mottos. And it is something that is true for the entire Europe, for the entire European Union, not only for Central and Eastern Europe, not only for the Baltics, but also for Western Europe. People vote for less radical actors that they still see as the representatives of their will. And these more radical right-wing actors in Poland were Liga Polskich Rodzin, it is the League of the Polish Families, Samoobrona Rzeczypospolitej Polskiej, the self-defense of the Polish Republic. And in Hungary, it was, and it is, in fact, Jobbik, the Party for a Better Hungary. The League of the Polish Family still exists, but it is not present in any legislature, in any legislative organ. This is the situation that was caused partly by the change in leadership in this party. Self-defense, in fact, were destroyed after the suicide committed by its leader, Andrzej Leper. And it merged with some other political party. And Jobbik, the Party for a Better Hungary, still is present in the Hungarian parliament, but is constantly criticized by Viktor Orban and by the representatives of the Fidesz party for undermining the true interests of the Hungarian nation. Quite a strange accusation for fierce Hungarian nationalists, but the peculiarity of the populist discourse sometimes shows a great flexibility. And as to flexibility, both these parties underwent a certain transformation of their own ideology. In 1990s, Fidesz was, as I've said yesterday, it was a liberal democratic party, but now it is not. Surprise, surprise. And law and justice in Poland, at least it did not. It never had an image of a nationalist. Of a nationalist party, just conservative and associated to some extent with the restoration of the Polish independence. But now the very process of the restoration of the Polish independence is in the spotlight of the party's critique. And the leaders of the Law and Justice Party say that the very procedure of how the Polish independence was restored was not very correct and was to some extent the betrayal of the interest of the Polish people. First of all, it is about the economy. And the final feature that unites these parties is that both are closely symbolically associated with the strongmen, Jarosław Kaczyński and Viktor Orban. If you say peace, I mean Prawo i Sprawiedliwość, you think Kaczynski, and vice versa. And if you say Fidesz, you mean Orban, and again vice versa. Though Kaczynski is not officially a prime minister, he is just a deputy of the Polish Sejm, but he is a leader of the party, and that's enough for him. Orban, for sure, is the prime minister of Hungary. Yes, and some additional information about the three clusters. Not regarding what I've said, so it is just to summarize somehow the parties themselves. Here we have also Cookies 15 party, but it doesn't deserve so much attention. Sorry. It is the successfulness of the parties based on expert scaling of a number of seats in the lower chamber. So we see that Praво и Справедливость. Unfortunately, Fidesz is not present here because, yes, because it was lost. Sorry. Yes, so Praво и Справедливость and Fidesz are most successful of these parties, and the second in Western Europe is a New Flemish Alliance. And yes, it is again a quite interesting tool for comparing Euroscepticism, the degree of Euroscepticism, but for now, unfortunately, it is accessible only for those who read in Russian. I still remember my promise to one of the participants yesterday to send the articles by Vitaly Litvin and Boris Makarenko. I'll do it necessarily today. And they are all open access, so no problem with copyright at all. And also an interesting method proposed by two Russian scientists, Nikolai Koveshnikov and Alexei Domanov, expert scaling of attitude towards European integration. It is a complex methodics, quite instrumental, I would say. And what is important, it doesn't require the specific soft. It just requires your expert knowledge and the table, the scheme coined by the authors. But unfortunately, for now, it is accessible only to those who read in Russian. So if someone here reads in Russian, I'll be happy to send this article to you as well. I don't know why they do not translate it in English. No idea. It should be. Okay. Types of nationalism again. Anti-elitism as another common feature of all right-wing populist parties. That is rather weak in Luxembourg, but still it is common in Belgium, the Netherlands, CE and Baltics. And claims for widespread use of compulsory power of referendums, of yes, development of internet voting platforms. So what I have yesterday called the appeal for the democracy of Athens and not of Westminster. This was some additional information, just out of curiosity, maybe. I think I've nothing more to say to this world, and I'll be happy to your questions, harsh critique, but you cannot kill me because I'm on the other side of the screen, but you can kill me morally, so feel free to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for a fascinating presentation. Now let's hear from participants who might have some questions, either people here in Cyprus or those on Microsoft Teams. You can either type in your questions or you can raise your hands and see if we can have a discussion about these things that Peter has mentioned. Well, let's hear from me then. let's kick things off. Peter, thank you very much. There were many new information in your presentation and things that I had no idea about. But I was wondering if I could kind of pick your brain about something. You've divided essentially 3 clusters that you've talked about today. The way I understand it, both from your presentation and from all the reading I've done, the situation in Central and Eastern Europe is the most severe in terms of power of populist parties and their actions vis-a-vis the rule of law and democracy in the EU and so forth. And I was wondering if we could make some sort of general observations regarding the roots of that rise of populism. And I was wondering if, because at the very beginning you started with the Benelux countries, right? With Belgium and the Netherlands and Luxembourg. And you mentioned yourself that they have a stronger democratic culture. And I was wondering if you think the strength of democracy is the prime factor or indicator of the possibility of a populist uprising. What I mean to say here is this: the stronger democracy is, then the less susceptible it might be to populist uprisings. And the reason why we've seen such rise of populism in Poland and Hungary is precisely because they're budding democracies. They're not countries with a strong European culture, or with a strong democratic culture, excuse me, decades old. And I was wondering if we could say the same about newer countries like the Baltics or the countries that have come to be after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Thank you for your question, Andres. Actually, it is quite difficult to assess what you've called the power of democracy, because in fact, I cannot say that Hungary or Poland are undemocratic as countries, as political systems. Now, they are not, because of their political parties that took the legislative and executive powers. But this does not mean that they are undemocratic at all. And we cannot measure. Well, maybe to some extent we may measure. But this tradition of democracy, this is not so much about the tradition of democracy, and that's why I've chosen for the concept of political culture, because political culture is not so much about the democracy itself, but it is about the way the people reflect, the voters reflect about their political system. And if a participatory culture was formed, the people reflect about the political system very actively. And they actually care not only about the input they do, but also about the output. So what do they get out of the black box? Let's recall David Easton model of a political system. What they get out of a black box, and how do they and how can they have an iteration, feedback? How they can make a feedback. In subject political culture, most voters, most members of the society do not care very much about how they influence the political system and how they give a feedback to it. They assess the results, for sure. They see the results, and they can judge whether they are good or bad. But they do not care very much about how to change them, how to influence them. So that is more about participation. It is not so much about democracy, because democracy, again, let's recall the very beginning of my yesterday's presentation, it is one of the essentially contested concepts. You cannot define democracy so as everyone should be content with this definition. And participation may be defined. So yes, participation, not democracy itself, but participation, indeed, active participation is to some extent a remedy from the rise of populism and power. But it is not a panacea, because it is a stick with double ends. A high degree of participation may cause the prevention of the populist politics rise, but it may actually bring populists into power if they present themselves efficient enough to attract these participatory voters. these reflective, clever, participatory voters. We cannot say that the United States of America is not to be a participatory democracy, but we have Donald Trump. So I cannot say that there is a universal remedy from populism in power, and a remedy that may work in some circumstances, but in some circumstances it may not, is participation. That's what I wanted to say. I don't know whether I have answered your question or not, but I've tried to do my best.
Thank you, Peter. That was enlightening. Do we have any other questions? Or anything else that people would like to add? If not, then I'll go on and ask one more question. Because, Peter, you mentioned Euroscepticism, right? And I was wondering if we could pick apart different elements of Eurosceptic rhetoric. And I'm not an expert in populism of Central and Eastern Europe, so I'm asking you whether we could actually do that and consider what kind of Euroscepticism is taking place. Because different elements of Euroscepticism could be influenced by different factors. What I have in mind here is that you could be a Eurosceptic and castigate, for instance, the undemocraticness of the EU or the technocracy in the EU and say that the problem with the EU is that decisions are made by technocrats behind closed doors, there's no democratic legitimacy, and therefore I'm against the EU, right? So that could be one line of populist rhetoric. Another line of populist rhetoric might be merely in terms of national sovereignty, right? By being part of the EU, by being subject to the European Court of Justice, we're giving away national sovereignty, and therefore we are against the EU. Some others might be against the EU because they don't want to cooperate with other nations or for all sorts of other reasons. I was wondering if we could distinguish between these different elements of Euroscepticism, because if they are indeed present, these different elements, then they might admit to different remedies. So if someone objects to the democraticness of the EU, then making the EU more democratic would lead to a reduction of the populist feeling. But if someone just sees the EU as an outright obstacle to national sovereignty, then by making the EU more democratic, you wouldn't really change any of that. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on this.
Thank you. Thank you, Andres. If I have understood your question correctly, I'll try to answer. For sure, not all Eurosceptic parties combine all the features, all the ways, all the terrains and domains of criticizing the European Union. They may indeed pick up some of them and stress them more. However, usually, at least in Western Europe and in most Eastern European countries as well, Euroscepticism is some discursive whole, again, some ontological and epistemological whole, where all elements are present, all three directions of critique are present, institutional, economic, and cultural. And remedies from Euroscepticism are, well, I do not see any remedy from Euroscepticism, you know, just because I think the European Union already does quite a lot to prevent the rise of Eurosceptic attitudes. The European Union does a lot of information work, of education work, of financing, and so on. But still, if it is convenient, if it is necessary for a populist actor to criticize the EU, he or she would criticize and will criticize the EU, regardless of what the EU is doing now. An example, not about the EU, the Euroscepticism itself, but an example from the times of the pandemic. It does not matter what, for the populist parties in the European countries whether their governments introduce harsh or soft measures. In all countries, regardless of the softness or the hardness of the quarantine, of the detention, and so on, the governments are criticized by the populist actors. They are criticized either for too smooth measures or for too harsh measures. They are criticized. If you want to criticize, you will criticize. So I cannot say that we may and we can somehow differentiate Euro critique, if I may say so, and cure it by some additional measures, because it is uncurable. Sorry for such a word. Yes.
Thank you very much, Peter. Let's see. Do we have? Yes, we have one question here.
After your question, Andreas, I cannot but say what I was reading in the news this week. Last Wednesday, current president of the EU, Ursula von der Leyen.
I'm afraid I don't hear very well.
This last Wednesday, Ursula von der Leyen had an announcement on various policies and issues on EU strategy, and following that, some they were expecting to see more on how Poland and Hungary are violating the human rights of their citizens and other European citizens. And feeling that in her speech, there were not so many measures or reactions on how these two governments are handling the situation, and they are moving from a more democratic to a more different.
Yeah, so in case you haven't heard the comment, it is about Ursula von Leyen's case and speech last week, yeah, where she outlined her vision of Europe. And after the speech, there was critique by members of the European Parliament about how she didn't go far enough in terms of laying out policies or measures to be taken about the domination of populations in Hungary and Poland by the ruling populist parties. So this ties in very well with what Peter has been explaining about if you want to criticize, you will criticize in the end, I guess. I don't know if Peter, you want to say something, because we also have a question in the chat.
I think it was rather a comment than a question. So if you do not mind, I may proceed to the questions in the chat. Or
yes, no, of course, go ahead. Do you want to read out the question so that everyone can hear it? The question says, I have a question about whether this EU notion is overriding the sovereignty of nations within Europe, especially the Eastern European nations established on the concept of old ancient notions of law of nations based on civilized and non-civilized, wherein the Eastern European nations considered lesser civilized. Hence the Western European populism idea put on Eastern European nations. So, Peter, if you want to say something about this.
I am not quite sure I have understood the question correctly. Mr. Dine Ashoka, do you mean that the Western European populism idea should not be put on Eastern European nations, or what was your question exactly?
If I may offer my interpretation of the question, I guess what Dinesh is asking is whether the idea of sovereignty and a sovereign nation was imposed on Eastern European countries. Maybe, I don't know, Dinesh, if you want to chime in here and help us understand a little bit better.
Hello. Hello.
Hello? Hello?
Yeah, hi. Could you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, actually, my question is quite related to in the context of history. In historical sense, we see the formation of the League of Nations, and that has been derived from the concept of the European nations, and especially the Western European nations, which consist of the more hegemonic power of the Christian dominant states, and they formed unification a model at a global level to rule the other, to unify the states together. So in that context, they based the system of law of nations, which has been based on the idea of the civilized people, civilized states, and the non-civilized states. That idea was being put forth at that time on the Asian and the African nations. But herein, I am raising this question in the context of Eastern European nations and the Western European nations, wherein the Western European nations are much more populist with the regime of Christian notions involved in them themselves, and this notion with the civilized, the Western European nations considering themselves civilized, and considering the Eastern European nations as a non-civilized one. So is it so true that the Western European populism is taking the idea to put forth on the Eastern European nations, considering them less civilized?
If again, thank you, dear colleague, for your question. Again, if I have understood it correctly, I may say that for sure there is no one cannot say about the non-civilizedness, if I may say so, about of the Eastern European nations. It is nonsense in terms of not only political correctness, but of the unity of the European Union and of the unity of Europe, civilizational unity and political unity, and so on. And in Western European populism discourse, Central and Eastern European countries are never presented as somehow under-civilized. They are presented usually maybe as not as equal partners, but not because of their civilizedness, but because of their economic circumstances. Because of their economic traditions, because of their economic, maybe some economic underdevelopment. But still, this discourse was relevant, especially relevant after the accession of 10 of 10 countries into the European Union in 2004, including Cyprus, actually. Now I think it is far less relevant than it used to be earlier. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. We have one more question here from Olga Shevchuk. She says, you mentioned some remedies which are not sufficient. I believe this is in reference to our previous exchange about the measures that they might be able to take. And Olga, you mentioned remedies which are not sufficient, and was wondering whether you could clarify or perhaps propose some more productive remedies that could protect societies from populism?
In fact, no. Because first of all, I cannot say that populism is some absolute evil that societies can and in fact should be protected from, because populism is inherent in democratic systems, as Chantal Mouffe wrote, and I here completely agree with her. So there is no democratic system without some elements of populism. For sure, if populism gets combined with radical ideas, if it gets combined with the ideas of curtailing the people's freedom, of nationalism, and some anti-migration, anti-social, and so on rhetoric, it should be for sure somehow protected. I mean, the society should be protected from such populist actors, but not from populism itself. How? It is an interesting question. Unfortunately, I do not see any efficient remedy. Information and participation are most efficient, but not universal ones. And if we act within a legal framework, unfortunately, I am not a lawyer. I am not a specialist in the domain of law. I know we have such specialists here, so maybe they could answer this question, or maybe later in the following discussion. If we act in the legal framework, we should be very careful, because if we ban some party or some movement, it may just re-emerge and become even more successful because of such aura, such aureole of martyrs, of political martyrs, that it may get because of this ban by the government. And this was the case actually of the Flemish Interest Party in Belgium, because it was banned in 2004 when it was called the Flemish Bloc. And it re-emerged in just 5 or 6 days, so just with another name. And it gained more and more voters because of this ban. Thank you. I cannot say anything more regarding the remedies.
Thank you, Peter. And I think you correctly kind of pinpointed the problem with talking about extreme phenomena of populism and the way in which we can tackle them. So do we have any more questions, either here or in the chat? Okay, so let's bring this session to a close then. I would like you to join me in thanking Peter for being with us both today.
Thank you.
Yesterday, we really appreciate your contribution to our summer school, and we very much appreciate your presence here.